Hi, welcome to the fourth and final AS psychology session of this programme in 2024. On the screen there are the titles of the sessions that I have already been through and a little overview of what we are going to be doing in today's session. So the sessions that I've covered already have looked at the assumptions of the approaches. And we've looked at lots of different exam technique within that. We've also looked at evaluation questions, again with some exam technique. And then last, we did some relationship formation questions with some exam technique. Now, what I'm going to do today is pull all of the content covered in the last three sessions together and do a bit of an overview in terms of exam technique, assumptions, evaluations, relationship formation, and just some top tips with revision and how to tackle just the amount of content that you have to know for this AS psychology, because as you are aware, there is a lot of content that you need to know and be able to recall in the exam. So, starting off with the assumptions. Each approach, and remember there are 5 different approaches to psychology that you need to know about. So you have the biological approach, the psychodynamic approach, cognitive approach, behaviourist approach, and the positive approach. And you need to be able to write about 3 assumptions of those approaches. So overall, that is a lot of assumptions that you will, need to revise and get your head around. But assumptions questions are really nice and quite easy to get full marks on, because the exam technique asks you for a description and an example. And what's also really helpful is once you know the assumptions and once you feel confident with them, they actually help you throughout the whole approach. So when starting to revise, I would suggest your assumptions to be the first thing that you learn and that you feel confident with, because they are sort of within the whole of the approach. Now, we know that an assumption is an idea or a theory, and it pins the whole approach together. What does that approach say about behaviour? Okay, and you've got to show the examiner that you understand the main principles of that approach. Your centre will teach you 3 different approaches and provide examples. Now, in the session on the approaches and the assumptions that I did, I spoke about lots of different examples. Now, the examples that I gave may not necessarily be the examples that your teachers have given you. Some of them are from the specification and from the mark scheme, and some of them aren't. They are extra examples, things that will still get you credit in the exam. So there may be a little bit of disparity, but I will talk you through sort of the main ones that you need. Some top tips for assumption questions then is that they are ranged between 4 and 8 marks. So they can be a really high marked question, which is really, really good. But you may also be asked about a 4-mark question. This is the tricky bit. So this is where they try and catch you out slightly. You can be asked to describe a specific assumptions question. So you could be asked on the localization of brain function assumption, or you could be asked to pick 2 assumptions of the approach. Okay, so your question could be describe the localization of brain function assumption of the biological approach, or it could be describe 2 assumptions of the biological approach. That way you'd be able to pick the ones that you want to write about. But because they could name any of the assumptions that they want, you have to make sure that you are learning all 3 of them. I have lots of students that try and get away with it by only revising 2 assumptions, and I always tell them, no, you have to revise all 3, because you never know what type of question you're going to get. And it does change every year. So that's a really important top tip to remind yourself that you definitely need to revise all 3. Having examples is very important in gaining marks. In order to get right to the top of that mark band, which is where we all want to be, you have to give examples in psychology. You have to be able to say to the examiner, yes, this is my definition of the word, and this is my psychology to back it up. Okay, that's where you get the majority of your marks from. So that's really important. And then using appropriate terminology will help you move up the mark scheme. Terminology, especially psychological terminology, is super, super important because it shows the examiner your understanding of the evidence, of the theories, and it gets you out of that basic mark band. It puts you into that detailed mark band, which is what we want, because then we will get more marks. So for assumptions questions, those are my main top tips. And lots of these top tips are the same depending on which topic you're revising. So those are my top tips for assumptions. This one is top tips for evaluation questions. So for each approach, you will need to complete 2 evaluations. The first evaluation will be of the study. So there are 5 different classical studies that you need to know about. And you need to know the overview of that study and the evaluation of it in terms of its strengths and weaknesses. The other evaluation that you need to know is the evaluation of the therapy. So again, you'll have 5 different therapies that you will look at, 1 for each approach. You need to be able to evaluate that in terms of its effectiveness as well. So how good is it at treating that thing you're talking about, but also the ethical issues as well. Okay, so is there any harm? Is there any psychological harm? Is there any consent? Are there debriefing issues? Could it actually make the person worse in the long run? It's all things like that that you need to talk about for the therapy. Okay. Then you've got the evaluation of the whole approach. So 2 evaluations, 1 for the study, 1 for the therapy. And then you'll have an evaluation of the whole approach. Now, this is where you can really show off your knowledge. You can have a real detailed explanation of your key things like determinism, free will, looking at holistic versus reductionism, and it's a really good place to bring in all of those key terms. Some top tips here, and some of these are the same as my top tips for the assumptions, but these are your higher marked questions. An evaluation is more difficult, so there's really something that you definitely need to make sure that you feel confident with, because it will always be the highest mark questions on the exam. So 8 to 12 marks up for grabs here, which is really, really important that we get to really get that grade that we need. You can be asked to look at strengths and weaknesses, like I said. Again, having examples is really, really important in gaining your marks, like I said before. And as always, appropriate terminology will help you move up that mark scheme as well. Okay, moving on then to relationship formation. So you will look at 1 relationship formation for each of the approaches, so 5 overall. And the main idea with this is that you link your assumptions to the formation of a relationship. So your assumptions that you already know, you have to make sure you have an example in terms of a relationship. Now, this is one of the things I see quite a lot when I'm doing examining or when I'm marking my own students' work, is that they will not link the relationship formation to the assumptions. And that's what can often be the deficit of their mark. The top tips, so they usually range between 4 to 10 marks. There is quite a range with this question. Sometimes they can just ask you about how 1 assumption links to relationship formation, and it can be 4 marks. Sometimes they can say, you know, describe formation of a relationship linked to 2 assumptions of the approach, and they can go up to 10 marks with this question. So a real range of marks available, but a really important question to make sure that we're getting right. As always, making sure that we have examples is really important, and ensuring you link your points to the named assumptions is super important as well. And then, as always, and something that I go on about all the time, terminology. Okay, terminology, terminology, terminology. Really, really important to make sure you have in your answers. Okay, so having a look then at some exam style questions. So with the assumptions of the approach, take this question, for example. So it says, using examples from psychology, describe evolutionary influences assumption from the biological approach. Now, if I were you, I would think, okay, without looking at my notes, without looking at my revision, I'm going to write down everything I know about the evolutionary influences assumption. And then once I've got everything down that I know, I'm then going to construct a question for it. Oh, sorry, gone the wrong way. Here we go. So for evolutionary influences, I'm hopeful that you may have written words like evolution, natural selection, altruistic behaviour, environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, all words that are key terms. Again, there's that terminology. They're all the main part of this question. So as you can see, where it says top mark band, 4 marks, description and level of accuracy is thorough and linked to psychology, effective use of appropriate terminology. So they're linked to psychology is your example, and then there's terminology there again. Now, you can see from the very bottom here, 1 mark, no link to psychology. So if you don't use an example in your answer, you will only get 1 mark. Okay, same, if your terminology isn't there and it's quite basic, you will only get 1 mark. Okay, so we really got to do more than that to get ourselves up this mark band. Some use of appropriate terminology. Okay, so maybe you've spoken about evolution. Good use of appropriate terminology. Evolution and natural selection, where, you know, a species changes and adapts to its environment over time. Okay, you're defining those terms. Effective use of terminology. For example, the use of altruistic behaviour. Altruistic behaviour is known as a selfless good deed where parents risk their lives to save their offspring. That is, you know, a descriptive answer that is thorough, that is linked to psychology, and you've got terminology in there. Okay, let's have a look at this one. So this is also an assumption of the biological approach. So it says, using examples from psychology, describe localization of brain function assumption from the biological approach. And again, it's 4 marks. The mark scheme is exactly the same. So description and level of accuracy is thorough, and we have an effective use of appropriate terminology. That's what we want to get right at the top of that mark band. So for this question, we would look for things like the lobes of the brain. So saying frontal, temporal, parietal, occipital lobe, maybe telling me what the lobes do and their functions. Okay, that would be that sort of description is thorough. So it's telling me what those lobes do. And then it's making sure that you've got an example. Now, there's lots of different examples that teachers can use for this. So there's Broca's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, and it's basically explaining that that is, you know, a deficit to the left hemisphere, meaning that they struggle in understanding and possibly producing speech. Or you could use the example of Phineas Gage, who had quite catastrophic injury to his forehead, which meant that his personality changed because he had a piece of his prefrontal cortex, his frontal lobe, removed. He was a very nice guy. He then wasn't a very nice guy, and it made people realise that your personality is held here at the front of your head. Okay, again, it's all things like that that are going to really get you that sort of thorough knowledge, describing to the examiner why they think different localized behaviours are within different parts of the brain. Okay. Little key terminology recap, because I do go on a lot about how important terminology is. There's lots of different words on the screen right now. So you have got lots of words that can be used in an evaluation. Now, my first thing that I would normally do if I had a class in front of me is I would get the students to define what those words mean. Let's not think about how they apply to anything. Let's actually think, what are those words telling us? And how could we start to identify bits from an approach that go underneath those subheadings? So it's worth having a think. Do you know what those words mean? Do you think you would be able to link part of the approach to any of those words? So have a little look at them, and I'll go through with you what they mean. Okay, so start from the top. The word scientific. If something's scientific in psychology, it means that it is a standardized measure, that it is something that maybe cannot be manipulated or changed. And it may mean that this is quite often a strength of an approach. If something's scientific, it means that nobody can manipulate. Okay, so for example, in the biological approach, and I'll stick with the biological approach in my explanations of these, purely because I've spoken about the biological approach assumptions, so it only makes sense that I stay with the biological approach. It is a scientific approach because in Rain's study, he uses scientific equipment. Things such as PET scans, tracers, continuous performance tasks, and everything that he does is very, very standardized. His participants, the 41 NGRI murderers, they have a PET scan. A PET scan can't be faked. It can't be manipulated. You can't think really, really, really hard and change the way that your brain works and is structured. Okay, so that makes it really scientific, which is great for that research because it means there's evidence to back it up and the evidence cannot be changed or manipulated. Okay, so that's first key terminology, scientific. Similar to the word scientific, you have got objective. And again, objectivity means that it's not open to interpretation. Okay, it is that. Now, again, with Rain's research, he used that cortical peel and box technique, where he was able to see on the PET scan areas of the brain that were very active and areas of the brain that weren't very active. That's an objective measure. Okay, it isn't open to interpretation. The brain area either is active or it isn't. Okay, so that's a real strength of Rain's study and the biological approach. It's very scientific, it's very objective. On the other hand, if you think about the psychodynamic approach and Freudian theory, Freud's theory, not scientific. Okay, he hasn't got very much evidence at all to back up his theory. He says we have a tripartite personality, 3 parts of our personality that are always in conflict with each other. Where's the evidence? He hasn't been able to scan somebody's brain and find the id, ego, and the superego. So there is a lack of scientific evidence for his theory. Same with dream analysis within Freud's theory. It's very, very subjective, which moves me on to my next key term. And subjectivity is that it's open to interpretation. Okay, subjective is the opposite of objective. And subjectivity is that it's different for everybody. Okay, so my own view of happiness, what makes me happy, may be completely different to what makes you happy. Okay, it's subjective, it's different. So my interpretation of a dream may be completely different to the next person's interpretation of a dream. Okay, it's subjective. It means that psychology often lacks credibility. And again, it's that lack of scientific application, okay, which we don't want in psychology. Next one, determinism versus free will. So free will is that we are able to have our own thoughts and our own feelings, and our behaviour isn't determined by something else. We have control of it. Whereas determinism means that behaviour is determined by factors that are outside of our control. Okay, things like your genes, your hormones, your brain structure. Okay, biological approach is very deterministic, okay? It doesn't really believe that your behaviour is driven by anything else but your biology. But we know that your behaviour is driven by other things, and I'll come on to that in a minute. Okay, so you've got determinism versus free will. That's always a really nice discussion to have in an evaluation question. Next one you've got is successful applications. Now, this is a question to ask yourself. Does what we've learned from this approach apply elsewhere? Is there anything else they can take from it? Has it helped us with anything? Now, the biological approach, because it's so deterministic and we know what determines behaviour, we know that lack of serotonin equals depression. Okay, that's determined. And if we know that something is determined, we can successfully apply it. We know that depression is low serotonin. Let's increase the serotonin in someone's brain. It may help with depression. There's a successful application there. Same within the cognitive approach with Elizabeth Loftus's theory. Her theory was that it was to do with eyewitness testimony, and she found that your memory can be distorted and changed depending on the information you are given after you have been an eyewitness to a crime. That has helped in courts. It helps us understand the impact of leading questions. Okay, so not only is it successful in its field in psychology, it's branched out into the other world, and we actually use it for other things. Okay. Then we've got reductionism, holism. So reduction, to reduce is to make something smaller, and holistic is bigger, okay, looking at more. So reductionism is that behaviour is being reduced down to something, okay? So the biological approach is reductionism. It's reductionistic because it only looks at biology. We know the reason why somebody is a criminal is more than just their biology, okay? Think about what else it could be. It could be their upbringing. It could be where they live. It could be their parents. It could be their IQ. It could be their school, their education. There's lots and lots of different things about somebody that determines their behaviour. Reductionism means that something is only looking at one thing, one bit of that. Holism is the opposite of that. So holistic means that they look at lots and lots of different areas of somebody's life to determine their behaviour. Then we've got nature-nurture, which is that very famous old debate in psychology. Very similar to reductionism, holism, really, and some students do often get quite confused between the two. Nature, biology, nurture, environment. When looking at criminal behaviour, lots of psychologists think, is it their biology? Is it their environment? Okay, it's always a really interesting debate to have. The biological approach is nature. It just looks at biology. Okay, so it's a really interesting one. Nurture, your behaviourist approach is massively into nurture because it says that everything is learned from your environment. And then lastly, we've got individual differences. So individual differences is what it says on the tin. Individuals are different. Does it take that into account in its research? Okay, does it only look at men in the research? Because then it's not looked at women. Okay, does it only look at children? So you can't really apply your results to adults. Okay, Rain's research was 41 murderers, 39 of them were men, 2 of them were women. Okay, doesn't really tell us that much about female murderers. Okay, and it should do. So those are a little terminology recap of things that you definitely need to be confident with when looking at an evaluation. So you will see, analyse the strengths and weaknesses of the psychodynamic approach. Pretty much all of the terminology that I've just spoken through is in the mark scheme. Deterministic nature of the approach. Idiographic nature of the approach. Idiographic is looking at individual differences. Unscientific takes into account nature and nurture application, so that's successful application, okay, and then comparison with other approaches. They are all things that examiners are looking for in a question, okay. Obviously it says any other appropriate analysis, and there may be other things that you are able to discuss well in your answer, but that list of terminology is always in the mark scheme. So that's definitely something that I would make sure that you're confident with, okay. Right, looking at a mark scheme for an evaluation question then. So we're looking at strengths and weaknesses. Oops. Right down here, let's start at the bottom. So no conclusion, a basic conclusion, a reasonable conclusion. If you do not conclude in your answer, you will not really move out of this mark band. Your answer could be amazing, okay? And maybe you get yourself here if your answer was perfect and you didn't have a conclusion, but most of the time, you're right back down here if your answer doesn't have a conclusion. When you're concluding, it needs to be more than just, in conclusion, there are strengths and weaknesses of the psychodynamic approach. Okay, yes, I know, we know that because we asked you that question. It's making sure that you give a little bit of evidence. Sometimes you may feel like you're recapping yourself and you're just rewriting what you've just written again, but in slightly briefer form. That's fine. I would rather that than a sort of superficial conclusion that doesn't really add anything. Okay, we want well-developed conclusions. Then up here we've got basic analysis is made of strengths and weaknesses. That could be basic because of lack of terminology or lack of evidence. Reasonable analysis is made of both strengths and weaknesses. You've got to make sure you have that equal, balanced argument, okay? So you've got to think 2 strengths, 2 weaknesses, and I'll explain them both. Thorough analysis is made. Something is thorough because you've added your terminology and you've really thought about the aspects of the approach that you can bring into your answer. Okay, that's how we're going to get up here. Structure is logical, saying 1 strength, 1 weakness, 1 strength, 1 weakness, or 2 strengths, then 2 weaknesses, then a conclusion. Okay, as long as it's logical and doesn't jump and read quite jumbled all over the place, then your structure should be pretty logical. An appropriate conclusion is reached based on the evidence presented. So again, you've really got to bring in what you've discussed in that essay into your conclusion. Okay, planning an answer. So this is a method that I use with my students. We always do peel paragraphs. So point, evidence, explain, link. Point, you're going to start with what is your initial strength or weakness. So one weakness of the psychodynamic approach is lack of scientific, or it's not scientific, okay? Evidence, right? What can you bring in from the approach to back that up, okay? It's not scientific because there is no evidence to support the theory of the tripartite personality. Can you go into any more detail about your answer? What would this mean for the approach? So things like the tripartite personality is made up of the id, ego, superego. This is a principle that Freud believed was in your mind, and they always are in psychic conflict with each other. However, there is no evidence that this happens. What would this mean for the approach? It means that the theory is lacking objectivity. Okay, so remember that's another key word. Link your point back to the question. This is a weakness because it means that principles in psychodynamic approach are not scientific and not standardized. Okay, you will see I've used a lot of terminology there, but I've also followed a really clear essay plan. Point, evidence, explain, link. And if you did that 4 times over, okay, 2 positive, 2 negative, and you had a well-developed conclusion, you are onto a winner with your answer. Okay, so here we go. This is an example of a question that I went through in the original video that I did on evaluations, but I will go through it briefly again here. So we said that it's scientific, and if we identify the key terms, so we've got scientific there, Unlike the other approaches, it deals with clear variables. That's our second one, measured in a lab. Okay, another key word. PET scans, they are reliable and easily replicated. Use of peel and box technique allows brain scans to be compared and checked. Lots and lots and lots of key terminology there. Lots of detail about why it's scientific. You're bringing in your knowledge of brain. Using the PET scan will ensure that RAIN's research is scientific, as a PET scan cannot be manipulated and changed by the participants or the researcher. This means that the results are accurate, not influenced by participants or from researcher bias, another key term. Then we've got more detail. FDG injection allows the researchers to understand areas of the brain that are active. This is an objective measure. Again, there's that terminology. This is a strength because it means that the research is objective and adds to the credibility of the research. It also means that the research is standardised, that's your key term, and controlled, which can help with reliability. So you're bringing in all of your key terminology, and it could be from research methods as well as your past to present unit. Okay, so there's an example of how that would work. Okay. Evaluation top tips, just before I go on to look at the relationship formation. Like I said before, and I won't repeat myself, 8 to 12 marks, making sure we're looking at strengths and weaknesses and things like that. But these sort of 5 points are, there's 6 points. 6 points would be my sort of top tips. So your argument must be balanced. Make sure you've got enough strengths and weaknesses. You must conclude, and I've gone over how to make sure you've got that solid conclusion. So it's making sure that you bring in your evidence that you've already spoken about. So overall, the biological approach is scientific, which adds to the credibility. However, it is deterministic and it doesn't look at free will. Okay, you're summing up your points. Use the peel paragraphs to make sure that you get your marks for logical structure. Make sure you have evidence from the approach, of course, and then depth and range. Range is an interesting one because lots of people with an evaluation question tend to focus mainly on one weakness is that there is an age bias, and another weakness is that there's a gender bias. That's not range in your answer, okay? You've got to go back to that list of words, those key terminology, to show range, that you know lots of different psychological sort of principles. Okay, last thing to look at then is relationship formation questions. Now, like I said before, these can range from 4 to 10 marks. The one on the screen is obviously 8 marks. And I have got some examples that I have been through. And they aren't full marks, okay? There are problems with these. And one really nice way of revising and identifying what makes a good answer is looking at other people's work, okay? Now, I have got lots and lots of practice essays that students have done for me across the 7 years that I've been teaching psychology. However, you know, it's always good to sort of be critical of other people's work, okay? Because it makes you highlight what's good and what's not good. So I will often give out old essays that students have done and get my students to mark them, okay? So they can identify what is going well and what may need improvement. Now, this one is okay in terms of terminology, but there is a basic level of detail included, okay? So we've got some things like triggers, kin selection, oxytocin, triggers, but we haven't got the word parental investment theory, so that's lacking. Kin selection, family members are protecting each other, which is nice. Oxytocin is a neurotransmitter. It's released when we are close to someone. It helps form relationships. Yes, but what else happens? Okay, it dips when we're away from our loved ones, which is why we get that longing to be with them, and we miss them and we want to hug them. There is detail lacking in this answer, so that's quite a good one to read and use as a benchmark for what would you do and how would you add detail to it. And then second question, this one's okay, this one's better, it's still not full marks, but it definitely uses more terminology in the answer. So things like triggers, again, they haven't used parental investment theory. Special relationships with our siblings, so we've got kin selection here. Down here we've got neurotransmitters, dopamine encourages us to form relationships, dopamine is released, oxytocin, this neurotransmitter, is released when the mother first sees her baby. It's believed that the release of oxytocin motivates us to form relationships. Yes, there is a little bit of detail lacking, like I said before with oxytocin. Why does it motivate us to form relationships? Okay, they've made some statements, they haven't backed it up with detail. Also, one thing to note, they've concluded this question, they didn't need to, okay, because it's not an evaluation question, it's only a describe, and we only need to conclude evaluation questions. So the conclusion on this says, to conclude, the reasons we form relationships can be related to many things, from evolution to the activity in our brains. That's correct. If that conclusion was on an evaluation question, it would not be a well-developed conclusion. It's kind of a little bit of a throwaway conclusion, I would say, okay, a bit of a panicked conclusion. So that's definitely something to consider, that if you are concluding your describe questions, it's a waste of your time in the exam, okay? You don't have lots of time in the exam and you have a lot of writing to do. So really make sure that evaluation questions are the only ones that you are concluding, and making sure that you are adding that detail where you can. Okay, just an overview then for relationship formation questions. They are ranging between 4 and 10 marks. We've got to have examples. We've got to make sure that our points are linked to the named assumptions and that we are using that appropriate terminology throughout our answers. Some revision tips then from me just to end this session. Make a glossary of key terms, okay? It's really important. If you write them all down, define them, remove the ones you can easily define, write a new list of other definitions of other keywords, write them down, and slowly you'll be able to define all of your key terms in psychology, okay? Creating mind maps of information you do know, and then go back, check your notes and add any missing information. I know that the sort of slang term for that is blurting, something that we use quite a lot with my students, and it really is helpful because it helps you understand what you need to revise more. Okay, so those are my two things that I would definitely start with when you're starting to revise, especially for the AS psychology. So that is my session completed. I hope that has been useful. Before I sort of check if there are any questions this evening, I just want to say a massive good luck for the upcoming exams. Psychology is a lot. It's a very demanding AS level, but a really interesting one, and one that you will definitely use in the future, the different principles that you learn. So it's definitely one to put the hard work into. So thank you very much for attending and listening, and I hope this has been useful. I'll just wait for a few minutes to see if there are any questions and answer those. Thank you.
There are no questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much.